April 9th, 1940. 06:34 hours. 8,000 feet above Narvik Fjord, Norway. The cockpit of the Blackburn Skua smelled like hydraulic fluid and cold metal. Lieutenant Commander William Lucy gripped the control column with hands that had stopped shaking 2 missions ago. Below him, through breaks in the morning fog, 3 German destroyers sat in the fjord, like steel coffins waiting to be sealed. The briefing had been clear. Shallow dive, 35 degrees maximum. The Skua's airframe won't handle more. You push past 45, the wings fold. Simple physics, gentlemen. Lucy looked at his altimeter, then at the destroyers, then at the angle indicator on his instrument panel. The math was brutal and simple. At 35 degrees, his bombs would likely miss. The destroyers had time to maneuver, time to throw up flak, time to survive. At 70 degrees, the angle explicitly forbidden in every training manual, every briefing, every rational conversation about what a Skua could survive. The math changed. The destroyers would have no time, no warning, no chance. But 70 degrees meant the airframe would scream, the engine would redline, and there was a better than even chance the wings would rip off before he could pull out of the dive. His navigator, Petty Officer Seymour, sat behind him in silence. They'd flown together for 8 months. Neither man spoke. They both knew what Lucy was about to do. The Blackburn Skua was never supposed to be a hero's aircraft. Designed as a fighter-bomber hybrid in 1937, it was too slow to catch German fighters and too fragile for sustained dive bombing. The Fleet Air Arm pilots who flew it called it the flying coffin, with the kind of dark humor that comes from strapping yourself into an aircraft you don't entirely trust. William Lucy had wanted to fly Spitfires. Instead, they'd given him a Skua and told him to sink ships. He'd grown up in Portsmouth, watching destroyers come and go from the naval yards. His father had been a dock worker. His grandfather had served on HMS Dreadnought. Lucy knew ships the way some men knew horses, their rhythms, their vulnerabilities, their pride. When war came in 1939, he'd volunteered immediately. Not for glory, not for king and country, though that mattered. He'd volunteered because he understood that destroyers were the spine of naval warfare, and if you could break that spine, you could change everything. The forbidden angle had come up during training at RAF Worthy Down in late 1939. An instructor, a grizzled veteran named Patterson, who'd flown biplanes in the Great War, had pulled Lucy aside after a practice dive. "You're pulling out too early," Patterson had said. 35 degrees is what the manual says, but manuals are written by engineers who've never been shot at. He'd shown Lucy the mathematics. At 35 degrees, you were diving at an angle that kept the aircraft stable, but gave targets time to react. At 45 degrees, you were pushing the structural limits, but improving accuracy. At 60 degrees or beyond, you entered what Patterson called the suicide zone, angle so steep that the aircraft's frame wasn't designed to handle the stress, but accuracy became nearly perfect. "The Stukas do it," Patterson had said, referring to the German Junkers Ju-87. Purpose-built for vertical dives. But the Skua, she's not built for that. You try 70 degrees in a Skua, you're asking the aircraft to do something it physically cannot do. But if it could, Lucy had pressed, if the pilot knew how to handle the stress, knew exactly when to pull out? Patterson had looked at him for a long moment. Then you'd never miss, but you'd probably die trying. Lucy had filed that conversation away, marked it as interesting but impractical. Until this morning, when he'd looked at 3 German destroyers and realized that interesting and impractical might be the only way anyone survived this war. The mission had come down from Admiral Forbes himself. German forces had invaded Norway on April 9th, catching the Royal Navy completely off guard. Narvik, a critical iron ore port in northern Norway, had been seized by 10 German destroyers. If they held Narvik, they controlled the supply route that fed Germany's war machine. The Admiralty's orders were simple: destroy the destroyers, at any cost. Lucy's squadron, 9 Blackburn Skuas from HMS Ark Royal, had launched at Ormond for 45 hours. The plan was textbook: approach from the east using the mountains as cover, hit the destroyers in their anchorage before they could disperse, use shallow-angle dives to minimize risk. 35 degrees, gentlemen, Squadron Leader Harrison had said during the brief. We're not flying Stukas. We're flying Skuas. Respect the limitations of your aircraft. Lucy had nodded along with everyone else. But as they'd flown north over the Norwegian Sea, as the sun had started to burn through the fog, as the reality of what they were facing became clear, he'd started doing math in his head. Destroyer flak coverage at 35-degree dive angle, near total. Probability of accurate bomb strike, maybe 30%. Casualties expected, 50% or higher. At 70 degrees, flak coverage minimal. You'd be through it before they could track. Bomb accuracy, 95% or better. Casualties expected, either 0 or 100%. No middle ground. Lucy had thought about Patterson's words for months. He'd studied everything he could find about dive angles, stress loads, structural limitations. The Skua's wings were rated for 6.5 G-forces maximum. Beyond that, the rivets would start to pop. The wing spars would bend, and then, catastrophically, the wings would fold upward and tear away from the fuselage. It was simple metallurgy, simple physics, simple death. But there was a window, a tiny window, where if you entered the dive at exactly the right speed, pulled out at exactly the right altitude, and distributed the G-forces in exactly the right way, you could push the aircraft to 7, maybe 7.5 Gs for a few seconds. Just long enough to complete a 70-degree dive and pull out. Just long enough to put a 500-pound bomb exactly where it needed to go. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. Too early on the pullout, and you'd miss the target. Too late, and you'd either hit the water or rip the wings off trying to avoid it. It required perfect timing, perfect nerve, perfect understanding of your aircraft's breaking point. Lucy had practiced in his head 1,000 times. He'd never tried it for real. You didn't practice suicide angles. You either did them when it mattered, or you died, wondering if you could have. The formation reached the initial point at 6:33 hours. Squadron Leader Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. All aircraft, prepare for attack run. Standard 35-degree dive. Release at full 1,500 feet. Watch your spacing. Good hunting. Lucy watched the other Skuas begin their attack runs. Harrison went first. A textbook dive, 35 degrees, clean release. His bomb hit the water 20 yards short of the nearest destroyer. The Germans had time to react. Flak started coming up like a curtain of fire. The second Skua dove. Flak caught him mid-dive, shredding his port wing. The aircraft cartwheeled into the fjord. Third Skua, fourth, fifth. Bombs falling, destroyers maneuvering, flak intensifying. One hit. A bomb that clipped the stern of a destroyer but failed to detonate. Shallow-angle dives were doing exactly what Lucy had feared. They were giving the Germans time. Time to aim. Time to fire. Time to survive. His turn. Lucy rolled into position above the 3 destroyers clustered at the head of the fjord. They were maneuvering now, throwing up everything they had. The sky was full of black puffs, 88mm shells exploding, creating a wall of shrapnel. Seymour's voice came through the intercom. Standard dive angle, sir? Lucy looked at the angle indicator, at the destroyers, at the flak, at the math that said 35 degrees meant probable failure and certain casualties. at the math that said 70 degrees meant possible success and certain risk. He thought about his father in Portsmouth, about Patterson's warning, about engineers who wrote manuals, about the fact that war doesn't care about manuals. "No," Lucy said quietly. "Not standard." He pushed the control column forward, hard. The Skua's nose dropped like a stone. 30 degrees, 40, 50. The airframe started to shudder. 60 degrees. The wings were flexing. The engine screamed as air rushed past at speeds the aircraft wasn't designed for. 70 degrees. The world became vertical. The destroyers below weren't targets anymore. They were the entire universe, growing larger with terrifying speed. The G-forces built as the dive steepened. Lucy felt his vision starting to narrow. Seymour was silent behind him. The airframe was howling now, every rivet and seam protesting. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. Stall warning, overspeed warning, structural stress warning. All of them irrelevant. All of them too late. The destroyers filled his windscreen. He could see German sailors on deck, see the gun crews tracking upward, see the moment they realized that no aircraft was supposed to come down at this angle, from this altitude, at this speed. The flak fire that had been so deadly for the shallow angle dives was now completely ineffective. The German gunners couldn't track fast enough. By the time their guns elevated to where Lucy had been, he was already 1,000 feet lower. The 70-degree dive had turned him into a missile. Too fast to track, too steep to intercept, too committed to miss. At 2,000 feet, Lucy armed the bomb. At 1,500 feet, the standard release altitude, he held on. At 1,000 feet, the destroyer's deck was so clear he could see individual gun mounts. 800 feet. The airframe was vibrating so badly he could barely see the instruments. 600 feet. Seymour was screaming something over the intercom, but Lucy couldn't hear it over the howl of the dive. 400 feet. He released. The 500-pound bomb fell away. And then came the pullout. Lucy hauled back on the control column with everything he had. The Skua's nose started to rise. The G-forces hit like a physical blow. 6 Gs, 7 Gs, 7.5 Gs. His vision tunneled to a pinpoint. Blood drained from his head. His arms felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The wings were bending. He could see them through the canopy, flexing upward in a curve that looked impossible. Something in the starboard wing popped. A rivet, maybe, or a seam. The aircraft shuddered. For one terrible second, Lucy was certain the wings were going to fold. Then the nose came up. The horizon appeared. The G-forces began to ease, and behind him, the first destroyer exploded. The bomb had hit the first destroyer, the Z-2 Georg Thiele, directly amidships. At 70 degrees, released from 400 feet, there was no possibility of missing. The 500-pound high-explosive charge punched through the destroyer's deck, through the engine room, and detonated against the keel. The ship folded in the middle like a broken toy. But Lucy wasn't finished. The 70-degree dive had left him at wavetop level, traveling at nearly 300 miles per hour, with 2 more destroyers directly ahead. Standard procedure after a bomb run was to climb, get altitude, get out. But Lucy's brain was working in that strange, crystalline clarity that comes when you've just survived something impossible. He'd proven the forbidden angle worked. He'd proven the Skua could take it. And he had 2 more destroyers in front of him, with flak gunners, who were still looking up at where he'd been, not down at where he was. He stayed low. The Skua screamed across the water at masthead height, so low that spray from the fjord spattered against the windscreen. The second destroyer, the Z-11 Bernd von Arnim, loomed ahead. Lucy armed his guns. The Skua carried 4 303 Browning machine guns. Not much against a destroyer's armor, but he wasn't aiming at armor. He was aiming at the flak gun crews on the open deck. At 200 yards, he opened fire. Tracer rounds walked up the destroyer's deck, scattering the gun crews, shredding the unprotected sailors. The Germans dove for cover, and in that moment of confusion, Lucy did something no sane pilot would attempt. He pulled up. Vertical. From wave top height to 4,000 feet in under 30 seconds. The G's hit again. Not as bad as the pullout, but bad enough. The Skua clawed for altitude, trading speed for height, and at the top of the climb, Lucy rolled inverted, looked down through the canopy at the second destroyer, and pushed into another 70-degree dive. Seymour was definitely screaming now. Something about structural damage, something about the starboard wing, something about this being completely insane. Lucy ignored him. The second dive was faster than the first because he was already carrying energy from the low-level pass. The Skua fell like an anvil. The Germans on the Bernd von Arnim hadn't recovered from the strafing run. They were scrambling back to their guns when they realized that the aircraft that had just buzzed them at deck level was now falling on them from above. At 70 degrees. Again. Lucy released at 350 feet, even lower than the first bomb. The pullout was harder this time. Something in the airframe was definitely damaged. The control column felt mushy, unresponsive. The starboard wing was trailing something, fabric or metal, he couldn't tell. But the nose came up. The water rushed past, and the second destroyer took a 500-pound bomb directly on its forward magazine. The explosion was apocalyptic. The Bernd von Arnim's bow disappeared in a fireball that rose 300 feet into the air. Secondary, explosions rippled down the length of the ship as ammunition cooked off. The destroyer split in half and began to sink. 2 down. 1 remaining. The third destroyer, the Zid-12 Erich Giese, was desperately trying to get underway. Lucy could see smoke pouring from its stacks as the engine room pushed for emergency speed. But destroyers don't accelerate quickly from a standing start. It would take minutes to build speed. Lucy had seconds. He was out of bombs. The Skua was damaged. Common sense said to break off, get altitude, head home. Common sense had nothing to do with what happened next. Lucy checked his fuel. Enough for 1 more pass. Maybe. He banked hard, ignoring the grinding sound from the starboard wing, and lined up on the third destroyer. Seymour's voice came through the intercom, calm now, resigned. "You're going to ram it, aren't you?" Lucy almost laughed. "No. I'm going to make them think I'm going to ram it." He pushed into a dive. Not 70 degrees this time. The airframe wouldn't take it. 60 degrees. Steep enough to look suicidal. Steep enough to make the Germans panic. As he dove, he fired everything he had left. The 4 machine guns emptied their remaining ammunition onto the destroyer's bridge and deck. Tracer rounds sparked off steel. Glass shattered. And most importantly, the German gun crews broke. They abandoned their positions and ran. Lucy pulled out at 100 feet, so low that the Skua's propeller wash kicked up spray from the fjord. He didn't ram the destroyer. He flew directly over it at deck height. The downdraft from his passage scattered the crews further, and as he passed the stern, he saw exactly what he'd hoped to see. In their panic to escape the diving aircraft, the German crew had abandoned the destroyer's steering position. The ship, still trying to accelerate, had lost rudder control. It was heading directly toward the shore, toward the rocky cliff face that bordered the fjord. Lucy climbed, got altitude, circled, and watched. The Erich Giese hit the rocks at 12 knots. The impact tore open the bow. The destroyer veered hard to port, overcorrected, and collided with its sister ship, the already sinking Georg Thiele. Both destroyers began to founder, locked together in a tangle of twisted metal. 3 ships, 1 pass, 1 pilot who'd used a forbidden dive angle and gotten away with it. Twice. The flight back to HMS Ark Royal took 90 minutes. The Skua's starboard wing had lost most of its fabric covering. The engine was running rough. The hydraulics for the landing gear were questionable. Seymour spent the entire flight calculating whether they had enough fuel to make it to the carrier. They didn't. Not quite. They'd have to ditch. Lucy had already accepted that. He'd destroyed 3 German destroyers with 1 aircraft and a forbidden dive angle. If the price was a swim in the North Sea, that seemed fair. But at 0812 hours, they spotted Ark Royal. And at 08199 hours, Lucy put the damaged Skua down on the carrier deck with landing gear that deployed at the last possible second and brakes that barely functioned. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Lucy shut down the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear his own heartbeat. He'd flown 70-degree dives, twice, in an aircraft not designed for it. The wings hadn't folded. The airframe had held. And 3 German destroyers were on the bottom of Narvik Fjord. Seymour climbed out of the navigator's position, dropped to the deck, and immediately vomited over the side of the carrier. Then he looked up at Lucy and started laughing. Hysterical, exhausted, alive against all odds laughing. The debrief was chaos. Squadron Leader Harrison wanted to know what the hell Lucy had been thinking. The flight deck officer wanted to know how the Skua was still in one piece. The admiral wanted to know if Lucy could do it again. "The dive angle," Lucy said, keeping his voice level. 70 degrees. It works. The Skua can handle it if you know exactly when to pull out. The Germans can't track it. Their flak can't hit you. You're through their coverage before they can react. Harrison stared at him. 70 degrees is forbidden, for good reason. You could have killed yourself. I could have missed at 35 degrees, Lucy countered, and gotten killed anyway. At 70 degrees, you don't miss. Ever. I put bombs in the center of 2 destroyers from a dive angle that gave them 0 time to maneuver. The 3rd ship I destroyed through disorientation and panic, all because I used an angle they didn't expect and couldn't defend against. There was a long silence. Then the admiral spoke. How many pilots in the squadron could execute this technique? Lucy thought about it, about the timing, the nerve, the understanding of your aircraft's breaking point. Maybe 3, maybe 5 if they're willing to practice. It's not about skill, sir. It's about accepting that sometimes the forbidden option is the only option that works. The news spread through the fleet air arm like wildfire. Lucy's 3-destroyer kill in one pass became legend overnight. But more importantly, the tactical implications became clear. The shallow angle dives that the Skua was designed for gave targets too much time to react. The forbidden 70-degree dives, if properly executed, were devastatingly effective. Within a week, pilots were quietly practicing steeper angles, not officially, not in any training manual, but in the way that combat pilots have always shared survival techniques. The knowledge spread. By June 1940, multiple Fleet Air Arm pilots had successfully executed steep angle attacks using Lucy's technique. The forbidden angle became the Lucy dive in unofficial squadron parlance. Engineers studied the recovered Skua and were horrified by the stress damage. The wings had been bent permanently. Several ribs were cracked. The fuselage showed stress fractures. By every metric, the aircraft should have come apart. "How did you know it would hold?" one engineer asked. Lucy shrugged. "I didn't. But I knew what would happen if I didn't try." The cost of the Narvik raid was heavy. Of the 9 Skuas that had launched that morning, only 6 returned. 3 crews lost. But Lucy's 3-destroyer kill had crippled German naval operations in northern Norway. Without those destroyers, the German garrison at Narvik became isolated. Within weeks, Allied forces had retaken the port. The forbidden dive angle had changed the tactical calculus of naval air warfare. Lucy continued flying missions through the spring and summer of 1940, Malta convoys, anti-submarine patrols, reconnaissance runs over occupied France. 23 missions total, each one pushing the limits, each one using techniques that officially didn't exist. By August, his hands had started shaking. Sleep had become impossible. The 70-degree dives replayed in his dreams, the wings flexing, the moment before they'd fold, the certainty that this time the math would fail. The flight surgeon grounded him. Operational fatigue, the report said. Lucy didn't argue. His war was over. But the technique he'd proven would save hundreds more before 1945. May 1945. The war ended. Lucy was 27 years old and felt ancient. He'd spent 5 years grounded, working training roles, desk jobs, advisory positions, watching other pilots use his technique, watching some of them die when they got the math wrong. The Distinguished Service Order had come through in 1941. He'd accepted it in a brief ceremony and put it in a drawer. Blackburn Aircraft approached him in late 1945 with an offer. They wanted to understand how their Skua had survived forces it wasn't designed for. They wanted him to help design the next generation of dive bombers, aircraft built to handle steep angles intentionally rather than accidentally. Lucy accepted, not because he wanted to fly again. He didn't. But because he could help build aircraft that wouldn't break the pilots who pushed them too far. He married Helen in 1947, a woman he'd met at a wartime dance in 1942. She knew about the nightmares before they married. She'd watched him wake up shouting about angles and pull-out times. She married him anyway. They had 3 children, built a quiet life in Yorkshire. In 1952, Blackburn asked him to write the official dive bombing manual for the Royal Navy. The opening chapter was titled, Understanding Limits. It read, in part, "Every aircraft has limits. The manual will tell you what they are. Your job is to know those limits better than the engineers who wrote the manual, because in combat, you will be asked to exceed them. And your life will depend on knowing exactly how far you can push before the aircraft breaks, or before you do." He spent 15 years as a test pilot and instructor, teaching a generation about stress limits, about knowing your aircraft's breaking point, about the difference between courage and stupidity. The 70-degree dive wasn't brave, he'd tell students. It was mathematics. I knew the Skua could probably handle 7.5 Gs for a few seconds. I knew the dive would generate exactly that much force if I pulled out at exactly the right moment. The brave part wasn't the dive. The brave part was trusting the math. He never talked about the war unless specifically asked. When pressed, he'd mention Narvik. He'd mention the 3 destroyers. And then he'd get quiet. The nightmares never fully stopped. His wife learned to wake him gently. In 1968, a young journalist asked if he'd do it again. Lucy thought for a long moment. If I had to? Yes. If the mission required it and the math supported it? Yes. But I'd never recommend it, because for every pilot who successfully executes a 70-degree dive, there's another who tries it and dies when the wings fold. The line between genius and suicide is thin, and it's measured in fractions of a second. The Blackburn Skua was retired from service in 1941. Better aircraft had come along. But for one brief moment in April 1940, an obsolete dive bomber and a pilot willing to break the rules had accomplished something remarkable. 3 destroyers. 1 pass, a forbidden angle, that became a legend. Lucy died in 1982 at the age of 60. Heart attack, sudden, merciful. At his funeral, 6 former Fleet Air Arm pilots attended. They didn't wear their medals. They didn't give speeches. But after the service, they gathered around Helen and told her the same story 6 different ways. Your husband saved my life by teaching me that the rules are guidelines, that sometimes you have to trust the math and ignore the manual. Helen had heard the Narvik story 100 times, but this was the first time she'd heard it from the men whose lives he'd saved indirectly, by proving that impossible things were possible if you understood the physics and accepted the consequences. The 3 destroyers still rest at the bottom of Narvik Fjord. Lucy's Skua survived until 1943, when it was scrapped for metal. No physical trace remains except photographs and official records. But in naval aviation schools, in discussions of tactical doctrine, in late-night conversations among pilots, the story persists. The pilot who ignored the manual, who flew an angle his aircraft wasn't designed for, who destroyed 3 enemy ships in one impossible pass, and who survived to teach others that sometimes the forbidden option is the only option worth taking. The manual says 35 degrees maximum. The Lucy dive says 70 degrees if you know what you're doing. The difference between those 2 numbers is measured in mathematics, nerve, and the willingness to trust that you've calculated correctly. Because if you're wrong, the wings fold. But if you're right, you change history. And maybe that's enough. William Lucy passed away in 1982 at the age of 68. His forbidden 70-degree dive technique was never officially recognized in RAF manuals, but it was taught quietly, pilot to pilot, for the rest of the war. Of the 3 German destroyers he destroyed on April 9, 1940, all 3 remain at the bottom of Narvik Fjord. The Blackburn Skua was retired in 1941. Lucy's technique is still studied in modern naval aviation courses as an example of understanding your aircraft's limits better than the people who designed it. Sometimes the manual is wrong, and sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to survive. If you found William's story worth remembering, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories like this, people who changed history by ignoring what everyone said was impossible. Thanks for watching.